Welcome to the Powerhouse Project podcast, a podcast celebrating and empowering women and a place for us to share our stories. I'm your host, Lisa Laronde. Today, I'm very excited to welcome Julie Cafley, a creative and strategic leader who, through Catalyst Canada, a nonprofit organization, works to build better workplaces for women while focusing efforts on equality and inclusion. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Lisa. Congratulations on this podcast. It's really exciting and I've been following it closely.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much. It's interesting. I've met now random people that have actually stopped me, and I'm so surprised because I really feel very strongly, as I know you do. I think we have this in common that, we don't do enough to share some of the successful stories or even some of the difficult journeys that we've had so that women understand that, we're not alone and we do have a community. So I'm very thankful for it and very, very honored that you actually reached out and said you'd like to join the podcast. So that's very cool for me. I actually remember when we met at the Orba AGM. It was only last February. It seems like a lifetime ago for me. And it was my very first panel that I moderated. And I remember that they sat us down. I'm not sure if you remember the planning session, but it was like, no male bashing. We're not going to have a Q&A, and make sure that you look at the male perspective as you're going through this, not only the women's perspective. And I remember coming out there saying, like, it's 2023. Like, what? Why are we? I'm always like confused. Do we really have all these rules on having a DEI plenary session? But then I started to follow some of the work that you've been doing, and I'm just so inspired and can't wait to learn a little bit about you today.
Absolutely. So excited as well. And I think it's interesting because, when you recount that story, I think back, that was probably kind of the beginning of a bit of the backlash that we've been seeing, right? Yeah. So that's perhaps not surprising.
Yeah. And I think I was really taken aback with it when I had done, I think, a Toronto building show prior to that, and we had a very small audience. The Orba one was much larger. I think there was like 200 people in attendance. So it was probably one of the first bigger ones that I've done, or moderated. But I was really surprised that they would think that we would get up there and, this would be, an all male bashing event. And I remember saying to her, no, the whole point of this is, we can share our stories. We can talk about our privilege and how can we as even allies, how can we, be supportive and help? And I think Orb is the best place to start. I'm actually on the board now. So hopefully we can, start to make some changes. We'll see.
Well, it's interesting because one of the reasons that I came to Catalyst was because, as much as I love a room full of women talking about women in leadership or the importance of women, I really realized that we need to have men in the room to have real change. And that was one of the things that really attracted me to Catalyst, because it was both men and women wanting inclusion, wanting equity. And it just is it's kind of the only way to go in my view. As much as I love a room full of women for fun, I think in terms of change, we really need to have everyone in the room.
I 100% agree with you. And I think we can't do it by ourselves. I've done some speaking engagements, and some women have came up to me and said, because I said, we need everybody in the room. We need men, we need women, we need allies. And they were like, why do we need that? And I said, I don't know. I'll generalize, and please correct me at any point in time. But I feel as women, we want to do things on our own, or we want to prove that we can do it on our own. And I'm like, what's the point in that? Really, what we want to do is we just want to be included, and we want equity. So that really requires everybody. And I think when I went through some of my equity training, that's kind of what I've learned is, I have my own personal perspective that came from, my upbringing and my tragedy and my experiences, which is going to be different than yours. And so we just need to look at different people's perspectives.
100%.
Yeah. So what actually drew you to the DEI world and your advocacy that you're doing?
So that's interesting. I think that I would say the first 10 years of my career, I was really naive. I was very excited. There was so much opportunity. There was room for advancement. And I really, at that point, would have probably said, we have gender equity. It's not a question. It's not an issue. And I would say it's only after that kind of 10, 15 years of my career where I started to be in rooms where it was exclusionary and where you didn't really people weren't even aware of the bias that was happening, whether it was selection committees, whether it was just discussions. And, there was women in those rooms, but they weren't being listened to in the same sort of way. And what really hit me was actually working on my PhD. And I I submitted my PhD, and I didn't do anything about equity or inclusivity in my PhD. And one of my supervisors said, Julie, what are you doing? Like, this is such an important story. And what I was studying was essentially the failed mandates of university presidents. And what you see in that sector is women and racialized leaders are highly underrepresented in terms of the number of leaders. And yet, they're highly underrepresented, yes. And then they're highly overrepresented in basically those that have unfinished mandates, so that don't finish their terms. So are basically let go by the board, or essentially, I don't actually say the word fired in my thesis, but are essentially let go
Yeah.
before the end of their term. And so when you see that they're highly overrepresented there, you say, hey, wait a minute, what's happening?
Yeah.
And what you realize, and I learned, I started to study, was things like the glass cliff, things like the glass ceiling, things like the unconscious bias in moments of crisis where boards might not stick behind that woman leader or that racialized leader in the same sort of way that they might stick behind someone that they just recognize more in terms of leadership, because that's all that they've seen.
Yeah.
And, I often say myself, most of my career has been with white men leaders. And so my stereotype in my brain is based on that as well, even though it's my greatest passion and my biggest belief in women in leadership. So that was my turning point for me. And so I went back to the drawing table. I did a whole chapter, and it was fascinating because I had the data that backed up the fact that women were actually being let go in moments of crisis. And it was textbook.
That's so interesting because we're seeing now women in politics. You're seeing that now, whether they're, and I think you're absolutely right, is that you're not supported, or when, in a time when that's actually what you need. And they were also talking now about this broken rung, where they're saying that, or whatever the terminology is now, that this middle class managers are for women. There's none here because this is the time that you're trying to have a family, and so you leave the workforce, or you leave that ability to continue to advance your career. So this middle ground, there aren't a lot of women in moving up the ladder. So now we don't have representation at the board level, at the executive level. And I think you were saying there were some stats about if you have women on your executive, that you're actually more profitable.
100%. There's a business case. And that's the thing. It's not, yes, it's the right thing to do, but
Yeah.
it's the smart thing to do. It's teams are more, we have all of the data, we have all of the research. They're more productive, they're more creative, they're more innovative. They see things from different perspectives when they have that diversity at the boardroom and at the executive table. It makes a huge difference. And so we know all of that. So how do we get there? And I was actually speaking to a CEO of a construction company recently, and he said, for him, in terms of his pipeline, he's got to go down 2 levels because they don't have those senior
Yeah.
leaders in their organization. He said, but I'm doing it, and I'm going to go down, and I'm going to find those people that are going to be able to lead this organization in a few years, and I'm going to, support them and mentor them and work with them. And so there's always a way through. And I remember, when I was young, I remember seeing at one point this announcement around a board of something, and presenting 6 white men, to their board. And I remember calling up the board chair and saying, hey, listen, how can you do this? And I'm like, well, go back. If these roles are being appointed by other teams, well, go back to those other teams and insist on having diversity in the applicants that you're being asked to choose from. So there's always a way to make it central to strategy, and to always just look at, this is your reality. If your numbers aren't good, well, share that your numbers aren't good and create a strategy. Don't focus on good intentions, because we all know that good intentions they sound nice, but they don't work.
Yeah. And I hear a lot about, well, then you're going to be the token woman. I've said, I'm actually okay. Or, you get a little bit of that feedback that says, I'm hiring the right person for the job. So there are, as this CEO that you were talking said, I don't have any women that are up and coming that could be in these senior leadership positions. But my point is you have to start somewhere. So we'll never get, to this equitable position if you continually, say that. I know even for us, when we're hiring women, we've changed the wording on our job postings, because women don't actually apply for the job. So it's not like, you're hiring the best person. You don't actually know that you're hiring the best person. And we're talking a little bit about women on boards. Like, do you have any advice on, because that's another problem, is that you're not seeing a big representation. I think it's really, really low for Canadian top businesses to have women on their boards. Do you have any, insight or advice?
I would just say there's definitely the pipeline. You just have to look a bit harder. You have to
Yeah.
be a bit more strategic. And, you also have to look at the experience for that woman or for that racialized person. If they are going to be the token, some are willing and some aren't.
Yeah.
So how do you create that space? How do you grow that trust? And it's the same. I've heard a lot of people with boards saying, oh, we want an Indigenous person on our board. Well, what are you actually
Yeah.
doing to advance reconciliation within your organization? What are you actually doing to ensure that these voices are heard at the table? So don't tokenize. If I agree with you, if you have to, if that's the way in, if that's the first step, that's okay. But how do you actually have a plan to back it up? And we did a study a couple of years ago looking at the performative nature of a lot of this work that's being done. And we surveyed 14,000 employees, and essentially 75% of them thought that the DEI work done within their organization was performative. So, employees see through this. They know if
Yeah.
it's just words. And I think about after George Floyd, everybody was talking about it. But, it's nearly 5 years later. How has the experience changed in time inside your organization? Maybe you have women at the table, but are they given the same voice that others are? There's a really, really interesting study, Lisa, out of Australia, because they have a requirement. They have actually quotas around their corporate boards.
Yeah.
And what's interesting there, and, you don't have to support quotas, but what's interesting is even when they have representation 50-50 of men and women, they find that the powerful positions, the speaking time, the decision making is still held by the men. So it's don't just put people at the table. You've actually got to listen to these individuals. You've actually got to engage them. You've actually got to seek out their voice if they're not being heard, because it's not enough. Even when we have the proper representation, we're still seeing that women's voices are being kind of covered up.
And it's interesting because that's what I find with when you are either the only woman or a few women that are on either in a boardroom or on a board. I agree with you. It's like your voice isn't being heard. So at some point in time, you just say it's not worth it. It's not worth my time and my energy and my effort to at that point. It truly is you're a token. You're here to check a box. And sometimes I use that to my advantage. But obviously, I'm in a different place in my life, and my confidence level is much different, so it's hard. But for some of the advice to give to young women, I just say stick with it, and then find your community of other women that have been through this, and maybe learn some of the strategies that they've used. And I think I was hearing somewhere that it takes 5 generations to actually make some of these changes come through, because as you said, this is all we knew. This was it was the white male was the dominant player, was the decision maker. It takes a long time to start changing that. And I say, it's not like you wake up in the morning and you say, I'm going to, not listen to the woman that's at the boardroom. It's just how it's always been. And I think the more that we talk about it, the more that I think people start to understand that this is a behavior that happens more often than I think people actually think that it does.
Well, and I think that's interesting. There's something that I heard that I love, and it's called culture carriers. So it's independent people that come into board meetings or executive team meetings. They're not a part of the discussion, but they simply observe. And at the end, they won't call out names. They won't embarrass people. They won't do anything negative, but they'll say, okay, do you realize that during this meeting, women were cut off when they were speaking 12 different times? Or do you realize that,
Wow.
Lisa said this idea at 5 minutes into the discussion, it was presented by Joe at 15 minutes and everybody thought it was a great idea, but it was actually Lisa's idea, and kind
Yeah.
of just really go through that, because I am a bit of an optimist, I guess, but I think that people don't realize that. As you said, it's so deeply embedded. It's this 5 generations. It's so deeply embedded that they don't realize that they might be cutting off, and not that it's excusable, but in a sense, it's like until you're making that awareness happen in the room, that's how you see the change. That's how you see the cultural change. And so, even amongst allies and other women, how do you say, hey, Lisa, isn't that the idea that, you just talked about it? And, how do you give that voice to people in the room? And, there's all sorts of biases, whether it's, older people, younger people,
Yeah.
racialized people, women, whatever it might be. There's all sorts of biases for all sorts of reasons. Those who identify as LGBTQ, there's all sorts of reasons that this might happen. So how are we just aware of it and thinking about it and constantly really just elevating those voices that are not being heard?
I mean, I think that's awesome. And I should just like gives me shivers because I think that's really what we have to do is so I say it's not that the men wake up in the morning and go, this is what I'm going to do. It's just that we've accepted it for so long that it's just normal behavior for people. And I think as we start to talk about it and I think we need to empower women to speak up. And I've always struggled with, is it a nice way to do it? As I said, I have that story. I had an executive coach and I'm the one who said to the guy, you must like the sound of your own voice because you just said exactly what I just said. And he was upset with me. I got written up. And I said, but the problem that I have is that everybody in the boardroom then thinks that behavior is okay. And again, maybe that it's not that you're thinking about it, but now you've heard all of this. I can pull you aside separately and have a conversation with you. But again, everybody else in the room is saying that basically I'm condoning the behavior. So I mean, we've got to figure out probably a nicer way to get that message across. But I think that's really cool that you would have somebody that would come into an organization and say that. Even in my US team, we have now a woman who's a GM, and she gets cut off at every single meeting that I'm in. And it's quite interesting. And so I've said to her, you just give me a sign, I'll stop it and correct it. But I also want to empower you to ensure that it stops on your behalf. So you need to figure out how you want it to stop. I have no problem standing up for you, but I also understand, you need a voice and you need to correct it. And then you need to carry that on for the next women that you empower in your company.
That's so amazing. We have a program called MARC, Men Advocating for Real Change. And typically the rooms are 70% men, 30% women. And we actually had one of the sessions this week. And on the final day, it's a 2-day session. And there was so much energy and so much vulnerability. And, we have, senior men in organizations who said, I actually didn't fully understand what women experience by the end of this session. And, we do a lot of research around this and we call it gender partnership. It's not about one side winning or one side losing. It's really about how we can all be our best selves. And whether it means a man feeling comfortable to take a paternity leave or whether
Yeah.
it's, or leave early to go to daycare or whatever that might be, it's winning for both sides. It's not, better for men or better for women in a sense. And, so the research that we do is really interesting. And some of the stats that really hit me were 86% of men, when they were surveyed, want to interrupt sexism when they see it, but they don't know how. They don't know what to
Wow.
say. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to do it in a way that's not awkward. But
Yeah.
when they do see it happening, 86% of them are seeing it and wanting to do something, but they just don't know what to do and how to do it. And the other stat that I find really interesting, because we talk so much about women and the imposter syndrome and things like that. And,
Yeah.
94% of men report having masculine anxiety in the workforce and that they have to fit into certain norms that are expected of them. And they're not necessarily always comfortable with that. So I think that that's why we talk about kind of this gender partnership. It's not about changing things for women. It's just changing things so that we can all be more ourselves and be happy at work. And then we get the business side of things where this helps with retention. It helps with attracting employees. It's the whole business case for all this work that we do.
And I say the same thing for the construction industry, where we have one of the higher suicide rates. And I go, we have to, look at men, women. What are we doing to ensure that people are psychologically safe at work? And that is truly part of you just need to feel like you're included, regardless of what gender you identify with. So you've done some research now on women in the front line. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's such an interesting area. And I'm so proud of the work because, Catalyst has been around for 62 years and we focused a lot on women in leadership. And that's still really important. And we're not there
Yep.
yet. But, it all starts with the front line. And, I think of people like Michelle Boudreau, who's now the CEO of McDonald's. She's on my board. She started out as a frontline worker at McDonald's and made her way up the organization. And, there's many individuals like that who live this experience. And so we did a lot of work focusing on women on the front line in manufacturing, in retail and hospitality in particular. And, none of this would probably be a surprise to you, but I think it's really important, the findings, and they come out in about 4 different areas. The importance of physical well-being. We talked to
Yeah.
organizations who said, you know what, we still don't have access to a bathroom for women's when they're working on the field. And, like they're around the whole facilities, policies, safety, physical well-being that exists. How are we able to ensure that women are living a positive experience on the front line in terms of their physical well-being? So that's one. The second one is hard, but it's possible, and it's around scheduling. And,
Yeah.
how can this be more employee-centered? How can we, reduce instability? How can we, ensure that there's, a bit of flexibility around things that are happening, and that we're avoiding the unpredictability? And that's a good example where it helps both men and women. It's
Yeah.
not necessarily, certain groups that are going to go pick up kids from daycare or have to come home and prepare dinner. But I think that's really interesting. And, one of the questions around scheduling that I found amazing was, I was talking to an airline who was saying, we have a hard time recruiting a lot of women as pilots. And obviously that's not a frontline role, but they were saying, for years, everyone had said it's an issue of scheduling. And all of a sudden somebody said, well, we've got all the frontline workers that are on the back of the plane serving meals, and they're adjusting to the scheduling.
Yeah.
So they're actually looking at creating a program to help to support the finances to help flight attendants become pilots through some of the expensive training, because they realize that the scheduling isn't a problem. We've been telling ourselves that for years, but there's a huge percentage of women on the back of planes that have been, sorting out
Yeah.
scheduling for a long time. So don't assume, certain things either.
That's awesome.
I think that the third one in our research that's come out is around growth opportunities. So how can, women be brought in and coached and mentored to advance through in growth opportunities within organizations? And the fourth one is really looking at empathic leadership. Empathy is really important in terms of values, feeling connected with the teams. And empathy, increases productivity, it reduces burnout, and it helps with retention. So how can we look at empathic leadership on the front line, and how will that help to retain more women? So there's a lot of great stories that have come out. My board chair right now is Linda Hasenfrantz, the CEO of Linamar, and she said, I need women on these frontline roles now more than ever. How are we attracting them, telling the success stories, sharing the positive side of these stories? Because there's enough barriers out there. How can we look at the what if and the possibility around women on the front line? So we're really excited about the work we're doing in that area.
That's awesome. I know I'm part of the global team for the National Women in Construction, and childcare it's a global issue. And Australia was leading the charge in terms of they have it's just the schedule, the times that the daycares are open or the childcare is open, so it's not conducive to a lot of women that are on the front lines or have you have to be at work early. You don't have access to public transportation. You can't get your kids to childcare. So I do think I keep talking about it, I want to form a strategic alliance that we sit down with industry, the unions, education, the government, and say, okay, let's actually come together and say, okay, here are some of the barriers that women have getting into some of these fields. And I loved your idea of, okay, it's not scheduling for being a pilot, it's about access to funds. So why can't we now, partner with an institution, an education institution, and offer, bursaries or funding or something like that, so that we can, start to reach our quotas. Even for women in the trades, we had this. It was the OGCA and KWIC did a gala together, and the Minister Williams was there, and she asked how many people in the room were actually on the tools, and out of the whatever 400 people that were there was maybe a table of 20 or 20 people throughout spattered. And I was saying, when I look at that now, this is what we're trying to do is we're trying to promote women in trades, but they're not coming to some of these events. And then why is that? And then I look at it and go, you know what, they're probably union. They're don't have access to the corporate money or the sponsorship that your ticket's getting paid for, or even probably the information flow is not coming because you don't have access to a regular email, work email. So it's interesting. Now maybe we can do some, maybe as KWIC we can actually at our AGM is sponsor a table for just women that are in the trades and donate that to, an organization that actually reaches out. So, or maybe we reach it through the unions. But it's just so interesting how you assume that you're reaching this population that you're trying to help, and you're not. And even if I look at our board, we've just elected our first woman in the trades since my term. So I shouldn't say first, because the association's been around for a number of years. But I'm very excited about that, because I really feel like that's what we need to do. We need to give those women a voice and understand what issues they're facing. I don't know what it's like to be a woman, on the road right now. So we need to hear their stories.
I love that. And, at Catalyst, we talk a lot about how do we look at fixing systems, policies? How do we look at, breaking down the problems and not trying to fix women, right? Like,
Yeah.
and as
Yeah.
much as, like everybody was excited about the kind of the lean in movement and the idea that women needed to be more mentored or coached or you know what? Women can do it. Women have
Yeah.
the capacities, they have the education. We've caught up on all of those sides of things. So how do we actually just fix those systems? And when you actually look at the systems that are broken, there's a lot of possibility, and there's a lot of, we tell ourselves certain stories that are just no longer relevant. And I think about, support at home. I've always traveled a lot with my job, and, my husband's actually, he's been a stay-at-home dad, and I've had that support. And when you talk about gender partnerships, it's a different reality for someone like me. And it's a huge reason for my success, because I've had that support. So how are we just looking at things a bit differently and really understanding what the challenges are?
And I agree with you. I have a very supportive partner for exactly the same thing, that, I could travel. It works out really well. And I've talked to another number of women that are moving up the ladder, and they're saying the same thing, that you need some level of support, because you just can't do it on your own. You can't manage if you have children, or some people have, elderly parents or pets or whatever. It really is, I really believe it's a partnership that we actually have to work together. And I think we need to do a better job of asking for help, saying, this is what I want to do. And I'm not saying everybody has to, raise your family and move up the corporate ladder, because maybe you want to, take a few years off and enjoy that. But I think as an industry, or as a corporation, we need to empower women to be able to come back. If you want to take 5 years off, that's great. Then we should be able to get you back into at least where you were. Or, I'm not sure what the answer is. I don't know if you've done any research around that, about women that leave the workforce for an extended period of time and come back in. Do they come back in at the same levels, or is there some kind of upgrading that's done?
So we haven't done specific research around that, but I think it's interesting. And, lots of women come back from a
Yeah.
leave ready for a new challenge and ready to do things in a new way. And so, there's actually programs that look to support, women transitioning back. And I know that, I think of myself coming back after 2 maternity leaves. I was afraid to complete full sentences. It's an intimidating time, right? And so how are you able to, have, and I think that's kind of at the heart of inclusion. How are you able
Yeah.
to have that vulnerability, talk about things like this, and make people feel good and feel safe? And, I was speaking with one of a bigger corporation, and they were kind of reacting to a bit of the words around DEI and finding it a bit polarizing or political within their organization. And I'm like, you know what? You can call it kindness. You can call it whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
You don't have to use language that you find people react to. You want people to be good, to feel good in their workplace, and they'll be more productive, and they'll be, better at everything when that happens. So how do you go about doing that?
I love that. I'm going to use that. Can you just tell me a little bit about experience? I'm just curious about the United Nations, and you were the Canadian delegate.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was last year. It was amazing. And I was part of the Canadian delegation. It's such impressive building to be there in the United Nations. We're there for International Women's Day. And it was a really inspiring group of people. And it was interesting there. So it was Minister Ian that led the delegation, and then the ambassador in New York was Bob Ray. So really interesting, and both inclusive leaders as well. Really impressive in terms of meeting. I think in many ways Canada is so admired in terms of what we're doing around equity and around gender. And, when we talk about childcare, there's so many different things where we're really, really ahead, and so many countries admire where we're at. And yet, I think of some of the challenges that we've discussed today, and, in the international, in the global discussions, we have really basic needs of women that are not being met across the world. So it's hard to kind of look at our challenges and looking how we're pushing forward in Canada, and yet realizing in the global context that we're really quite far ahead. But once again, I think in that discussion, it's like, how are we looking at those systems? And I think of so many examples where we've been able to create opportunities. We know that women give back to their communities, back to their villages. When they are, when moms are educated, kids are more likely to be educated. There's
Yeah.
such great research around the power of women to change communities. And so that's really exciting, I think, within the global discussion. So it was really nice to be there. Of course, Canada is doing a lot. So it was really a point of pride for sure.
Well, that's awesome. Now, where do you see DEI going over the next, I don't know, 5 years or so, or the next 10 years? Do you feel like we're still, I feel like that we've kind of reached this lull. We had all of this momentum going, and I feel now that everyone's like going, oh, no, we're good now.
Yeah, and we're far from good. There's still lots that needs to be done. I think that when I look at the CEOs who are on my board, they know that we need to double down now more than ever. I think what makes me really proud of the work that Catalyst does is that we've been around for 62 years. This is not a passing trend that we've been doing over the past 5 or 10 years. It was a mom essentially who created Catalyst 62 years ago when she had a couple of kids, wanted to go back in the workforce, and realized there was a ton of barriers in her way. And now, we look at so many issues of intersectionality and bias that exist on so many different levels. And, there's just so much work to do. And I think that, I think it's a time for a bit of pragmatic DEI. The business case, I think, is more and more important. I think the most important thing is that we just have to keep on having the discussions. And this polarization, all of, when you actually have a conversation with someone, you realize that we all really do kind of want the same thing.
Yeah.
I remember at one point, I used to work at the Public Policy Forum, and we had an event where we honored all former Canadian prime ministers. And that evening, I was so inspired by all of them. And there was kind of equal numbers of conservative, liberal that were up there. And I thought, if you weren't Canadian, if you didn't know who these people were, when they're former prime ministers, they're much less political. And, in terms of our values as Canadians, we actually are very similar and on the same page. And I thought it would be interesting if you didn't know who any of these individuals are, if you were even able to place them in terms of right-leaning or left-leaning. They were all very, for me, all represented really, strong Canadian values. And so I think, how do you just have those discussions? And I think with our 62 years of experience, it gives us the confidence because we've got the research and we're not afraid to have those discussions. And I think we see a lot of division right now on so many topics. And if we're able to just have the conversation, I think we'll realize that we're not as far apart as we might think we are.
Now, is access to your information free, or is there a membership, or how do you get some of the research that you've been doing?
Yeah, so Catalyst is a global organization. So we have people on the ground in Canada, US, and Europe. We have about 500 global organizations that we support, and we have about 200 organizations in Canada. Some of our information is public and widely available, but we do have some supporter-only content. And so we really work with those 200 companies in Canada, on a monthly basis to troubleshoot with them, to help to curate resources and information that they can, share internally with their employees. So, so we're always happy to have conversations and support organizations. And there is a lot of public information and research on our website for sure.
That's awesome. So we usually end our podcast to ask a question. If you could go back and give your younger self some advice, what would it be?
Oh, what would it be? I think it's the idea. There's a word in French that I love, and it's oser, OSER. And so it's kind of to dare. And I think that, when I think about early on in my career, I worked as a chief of staff to presidents in a university. And I think, what became interesting then was actually having real conversations and speaking truth to authority was really interesting. So I was the person who said, that was a really bad speech, or your tie is crooked, or these people on campus hate you right now. And so I think, being able to say those real things is really important, and kind of getting back to what we were talking about in the beginning in terms of authenticity. How are you able to just, have those real discussions and say those things with good intention behind it, and really, able to advance change in a way because you're able to have real conversations and say real things.
And I think that's very important. I think, we don't take enough chances. So I like your dare. It's not
Yeah.
that you're asking to take risk, but I think we need to sometimes put ourselves out there. I always say, what's the worst thing that's going to happen to you? Either you get fired, but that's really, that's the worst thing. And you're definitely going to get another job. So I think that's awesome. Julie, I want to thank you so much for spending the time with me today. You are an inspiration to me. From the first day I met you and I started to follow you on LinkedIn, and I'm just so impressed with what you're doing for supporting women. And I love the fact that we're continuing to, support one another and continue to share our stories. So please continue to do what you're doing. I love your passion and your enthusiasm. I can only hope I can match it.
The admiration is totally mutual, Lisa. I'm so delighted, and look forward to getting into trouble in the future together.
I love that. I can't wait, Julie. You can learn more about today's guest in the show notes and at thepowerhouseproject.com. And if you know anyone in leadership or in the skilled trades who would like to be on the show, please send in a voice note or a message on the website. Follow and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And thank you so much for listening.